the Director of Economics for the Caribbean Development Bank.
Okay, thank you very much, Terrence. It's a pleasure to be here, and just want to check that you're hearing me fine.
Yes, we can hear you fine.
Okay, so let me just share my screen. Okay, maybe I'll just share the file.
Yeah, I think it's easier if you share the slide, just the slides.
Yes. Just bear with me.
You got it.
Okay. It's saying that it's just processing at the moment, so I'll just wait for it to come up.
Here.
Yes. Yeah, so well, while that's processing, I will present, of course, on the need for sustainable growth. Is that there now? Can you see it? Great. I hope the audience members can see that screen now. Okay, so I'll be presenting on the sustainable growth and the need for diversification for Guyana. And what I will attempt to do as I look through my agenda is really to give you a recap, and I think it's important to us to always remind ourselves that all developing countries are working towards the Sustainable Development Goals, and to do a recap of where Guyana is with respect to the SDGs and the economy, and then how can Guyana achieve sustainable growth and diversification. And then at the end, I really just want to touch a little bit on the Essequibo area and the importance of that particular topic for Guyana at this point in time. So here's a recap of Guyana's SDGs and economy. So if I look at this here, and what we've attempted to do in this slide is really to review all 17 SDGs and to ascertain where Guyana is currently. At the bottom of that slide, I actually have the key, as it were, as to how to interpret each of these slides. So, of course, an upward arrow, it suggests that the country is on track on trying to, or maintaining that SDG achievement. That arrow, that yellow arrow that is slightly going towards the northeast, is showing again that where Guyana is with respect to moderately improving. An arrow pointing to the east, that is pointing to your right, shows that it is stagnating on that particular SDG. And again, I don't have data, unfortunately, for SDG 10 and SDG 12, but for all of the others. So in the main, what we're seeing is that Guyana is working towards, but also stagnating in some important SDGs. But however, on that number one SDG of no poverty, it is making progress and should be on track to maintaining or achieving that particular SDG. Of course, no country ever has zero poverty, but certainly I think Guyana is on track to make some good progress with respect to that particular indicator. And of course, that will only be boosted by the exploitation of its oil and gas reserves. And if, for example, the resource rents from that can be distributed more evenly. I know that that's a great if based on the other presentations that were done before me, but it's important for us to understand that there is the potential for Guyana to achieve great things with respect to SDG 1. So as I move along, we all know that Guyana's economy is primarily driven by the growing mining and quarrying sector. And it has always had a growing mining and quarry sector. But now in particular, with the advent of oil and gas, and well, not gas as yet, but oil production, we can see that that is driving significant economic growth within Guyana, certainly over the last 2 years that I have data available for there. So as you can see there, mining and quarrying is now taking up the bulk of the contributions to GDP, real GDP within Guyana. And of course, as I said before, specifically the oil and gas sector, since the discovery of substantial oil reserves offshore Guyana in 2015, and of course again in 2018, as you can see here. Now, one of the things, unfortunately, with oil and gas, and that is the way how we tend to exploit mining resources, particularly in our countries, is that in all other types of economic activities, we find that most value added is distributed to workers as wages and to owners as profits. However, when it comes to oil and gas distribution of rents within the country, those rents go first to the government, who will then need to redistribute them through public spending. And I think it's really important for the audience members to understand that difference, because oil and gas on its own, while contributing significantly to real GDP growth, oil and gas does not really contribute directly to wages and profits within the country. It is the distribution of the revenues that the government will receive from those oil and gas discoveries that will then determine how that impacts the society at large. So then it becomes really important for the government to distribute those revenues in a sustainable way, in a way that will tend to project economic efficiency, but also, I would say, economic diversification, but also in a fair way so that we have an equal distribution of those rents as far as possible. Now, resource-based development, like oil and gas, does not bring more jobs. At least it's what I should say, direct jobs. But as you can see here, the share of employment across sectors remains largely the same as it did before Guyana started to produce oil. And we still have a significant amount of persons working in lower paying wholesale and retail trade and in the agriculture, forestry, and fishing sectors. Now, one of the things...
And this is precisely the point that I've been trying to get. This is the nub that I want us to kind of unlock. Exactly the slide that you without. This is what the program in some large sense has been about. You know, like you have these rents go to the government. The government has to redistribute them, but it has to redistribute them in a economically sound, stable, sustainable manner. And how do you do that? That's the question that we've been trying to answer.
Right. Okay. Well, people, this slide in particular shows you that a bulk of the employment is still in those sort of lower, yes, yeah. in the lower paying sectors. But what tends to happen in this type of economy, and I think it was alluded to by the previous presenter, is that you would probably have wage inflation that then leads to this Dutch disease, or what I learned many years ago as a mechanism of a petroleum economy by the great economist Dudley Sayers. For me, that gives a much better understanding as to what happens. It really, the oil and gas sector, because it pays such high wages, but because it employs so few people, many people then say that it then drives this inflation within the economy. And more workers in other sectors then demand higher salaries. And that, in effect, can then drive this problem of making those other sectors uncompetitive. And so this is why I think Guyana in particular, based on what the other presenter says, has to be very mindful, based on some of the goals and the objectives that the government has set out, certainly not only for itself, but at the CARICOM level, to be much more self-reliant on food and to reduce the food import bill, that it's going to have to be very mindful of that. And so, Terrence, one of the things I really want to say here is that it will not only be about redistributing the rents in a fair and sustainable and an efficient way, but also understanding that all other sectors that are important in the economy need to be facilitated, just as oil and gas is being currently facilitated. I've seen that too often in the Caribbean context, whereby the main sectors get all of the attention from our governments, but other supporting sectors like agriculture do not get the attention, and so eventually wilt and die. And that is something that I think Guyana, because it's such a wonderful opportunity for it to become, we've always said, the breadbasket of the region. If it is to become that, the government will also have to pay specific facilitation mechanisms to that sector. And now, Guyana's growing economy will provide significant opportunities for the private sector to grow. But unfortunately, and this comes back to my point that I was just making, the business climate is quite unfavorable. And so if it is only the oil and gas sector that is experiencing a very good business environment, well, then, of course, the economy will become a monocrop economy, where the government then gets revenues from that and then tries to distribute it all over. And so while that can be good in some ways, you do really want to have the other sectors being competitive as well, and so growing and also providing their own high wages. And because of the poor business environment, it is this point that I really want to make, that we need to ensure that the government is also facilitating business development and competitiveness in all sectors across the economy, and not only in the oil and gas sector. Yes. Now, we know Guyana has urgent need for intensive investment in public infrastructure, particularly in areas such as roads, electricity, and clean water. And I think with the oil and gas resources, this can be a way for the government to spend those resources in a way that provides efficiency, but in a way that can also help facilitate economic activity in other sectors. And besides that, there's probably an opportunity here for the government to not only be the sole financier of these types of projects, but to seek to build partnerships, perhaps with local private sector companies, for the building out of some of this infrastructure, and thereby, through government procurement, enable a development of other sectors that will help the diversification of the economy. And so what we have tended to see in the past in many countries, that the government simply finance all of these things themselves. And perhaps there are some contractors who would win huge projects, but yet the real skills, the real capability and capacity associated with building out this infrastructure might be lost. And I think there's a great opportunity for the government to consider how it goes about building out this much needed infrastructure through significant partnerships with the private sector. And may I dare say that I know that there's a local content policy in place for the oil and gas sector, but perhaps in building out some of these very important infrastructure, that the government might want to consider some sort of local content policy on this as well, so that Guyanese firms build out the capacity and indeed have the capability to do this within the country. And then eventually, because of that government procurement, like what Japan had done years ago through its procurement, its firms were then able to go outside of Japan and to conquer additional markets. I think Guyana has an opportunity to do that if the government procures well and ensures that its local firms participate in this. So how can Guyana achieve sustainable growth and diversification? These are just some of the points I really want to say. We have also looked at Guyana's Human Development Index. At the moment, it's not as high as some of its other Caribbean counterparts, and government needs to pay particularly important focus on this. And it comes back to that point that you were making, Terence, when you were introducing me. As you know, education is something that I tend to harp on a lot. And it's very important that the government invests significant amounts of money into education. So sometimes I run into many arguments with some of my fellow economists about how governments should go about spending money that they come into. And I always say I don't see any problem with spending excessively on education if you want to build out human capacity. And in terms of human capital, it is not only education, but I think significant expenditure on health as well. That is to say, on preventative health measures, but also on providing world-class health facilities so that Guyanese can be healthy and also productive at the same time. So I think that a lot of money should be spent on these areas to bring them up to where they are. I see no problem in the government spending significantly on this, as long as, of course, it is done in a transparent and, of course, in a sustainable way. But right now, I think Guyana needs to spend significantly on education, and perhaps work with its other Caribbean counterparts in reformulating the CXC curricula. The Caribbean needs a total revamp of its education curricula based on what our children will need to be competitive in this century. And I'm almost finished. I just have 2 more slides. How can Guyanese enhance their development prospects? Well, I've tried to summarize here in a few bullet points: development and operationalization of medium-term investment strategies. And I think here is an opportunity to also integrate those partnerships that I've spoken about, to consider if there's possibility from some type of local content within that, of course, within the legal constraints of that, to ensure that Guyanese firms and Guyanese people benefit from the build-out of this infrastructure. Because what tends to happen traditionally is that governments would simply subsidize electricity or subsidize water and say to the people of those countries, well, that's how you're benefiting from the oil and gas resources. But I think that there's an opportunity here in the medium-term investment strategy to say that we are going to procure via local firms and ensure that local people get those jobs, and so building out the capacity. Yes. So there are many ways. Increasing infrastructural investments, as I spoke about, enhancing human capacity. And here I just really want to harp on the need for building out human capital. And that also includes investing in health and avoiding what I call the MOPE, the mechanism of an open petroleum economy, which we can discuss during the questions and answers. And then finally, my last slide. In the immediate term, Guyana needs to maintain stability and ensure good governance. And here I've just added some of the points that I need to touch on here. For example, that risk of flooding, how do you mitigate that? Looking at the divisions in politics. And again, one of the earlier presenters discussed a little bit on building out institutions, which I think was a very, very good point, which I need to also endorse as well. And I do have a few more slides, but I really don't think I need to speak too much on the Essequibo area. But just to say that this whole area of carbon credits is an area that Guyana should try to build on, and to see how it can also draw in additional funds and so diversify the government's revenue streams away from oil and gas as well. Yes, and the so-called risks associated with Essequibo. So, Terence, I've tried to just stay within my 15 minutes, and thank you very much for having me.
This one could go on forever for me, because I think this really hits at the nub of the problem. We've been doing, this is the second season, so 12 months, and it's program number 9, so 12, 7, 19. So we've done 19 of these things, and really at the core has been this question that you hit on in that slide. And it's the structural game that I think is creating so much anxiety in Guyana. This particular industry results in the rents from this industry go to a bank in New York City, and the signatories on that bank are the government of Guyana, whoever the government of Guyana is. And it is that entity that then has the challenge of figuring out how to redistribute this wealth in some meaningful, sustainable way. And there are all of these sort of people calling upon, for example, the question you mentioned a moment ago, the need to invest in health and education. Well, I mean, at this moment, and the way in which higher salaries in the oil and gas industry sort of drives higher salaries in the rest of the economy. Our teachers are on strike. It seems that it should be a no-brainer that we should pay teachers whatever, they demand, and it logic. But there also seems to be an issue here where the question is, what is the optimum way to balance that, so that when you spend the money on infrastructure, when you spend the money on education, when you spend the money on health, how do you do it so that it's sustainable over a long time and everyone benefits? And this is for us, it's a challenge, and one can see it in the Guyanese newspapers on a daily basis. And so, in a way, it cues you for us, Bright.